Welcome to Idiot Proof, the podcast dedicated to digital ID. Your hosts are the lovely Sally McKenzie and myself, Rob Hotchin.
We hope you enjoy listening and maybe even learn a thing or two. I know I will. So welcome back to Idiot Proof. On today's episode, Rob is joined by Becky Holmes, the brilliant mind behind the popular X, formerly Twitter, account @DeathToSpinach. What started as a fun way to call out romance scammers has evolved into a full-blown mission, and Becky is now a leading expert on romance fraud. Today, she and Rob take us on a deep dive into the murky world of online romance scams, exposing the emotional damage these fraudsters cause and discussing wider implications, including human trafficking and coercive control. We'll also get to hear some hilarious examples of Becky's encounters with scammers and learn why education and digital identity are crucial in protecting ourselves from falling victim. Let's dive in.
Thank you, Becky, for joining the podcast. It is very much appreciative. It would be great. We've just done, obviously, an introduction, but it'd be great if you could give a little bit about who you are and kind of why you came to writing the book.
Oh, well, I don't work in finance or banking or anything like that. So how I came about it is probably a bit stranger than how somebody normally writes a book. I set up a Twitter account during lockdown, very, very bored. And I got all of these messages from these really handsome men saying, oh, you're the most beautiful thing in the world and you're so gorgeous. Now, I'm in my mid-40s and these guys were like early 20s and really buff. So there was no way that was real. But there were so many of them all at once. And I was blocking them and deleting them. And then one day, when boredom had hit unbearable heights, I started replying and just thinking, I'm going to waste their time. I'm going to waste as much time as possible. And I started putting these interactions up on Twitter and people really liked it. And the more that I did, the more that genuine victims of romance fraud got in touch. And I got really interested in the subject. And then the book came from there. I couldn't stop researching it.
I'm trying to think of the British comedian, and he did a thing on 8 out of 10 cats around, and he was writing to the parking warden. Is it Joe Lycett?
Yes,
you know
Joe
him?
Lycett. Do you know, people tag him in my stuff all the time.
Do they?
Yeah, and he never replies.
Joe, come on.
Yeah, come on, Lycett. I'm sure you're listening.
Yeah, no, he's brilliant. And then the other one is that YouTuber, I've forgotten his name.
Is it Kit Boga?
No, it was the guy who did the Welcome to Luton prank. So where he put it on the wrong airport. So when people were flying into Luton or flying into Stansted or whatever, it said Welcome to Luton on top of a building. So everyone on the aeroplane was like, ah. In fact, funny enough, this week, Specsavers have just done a big ad in Sydney and Melbourne airports. And in Sydney, it says Welcome to Melbourne. Then underneath it says should have gone to Specsavers and vice versa. Which I think is originally from that guy, that YouTuber. Max Frosh.
I don't know him, but I'm going to look it up. It sounds great.
He's good. He's a prankster.
My favourite sort of corporate prank was when the London Eye was due to go up. It was sponsored by, I think it was British Airways, and it didn't work the first time. So Virgin sent this massive airship across London saying BT can't get it up, or British Airways can't get it up.
Oh, good.
It was amazing. And they just came up with this like air balloon sort of overnight with this. And what was great is that they didn't put Virgin on it, but because it was big and red, everyone knew exactly who it was. It was amazing.
I love how we've already got off topic. This is going to be a classic theme of this conversation. I was going to say, you said corporate prank. I was thinking about my favorite prank to do on other people in the workforce, which is getting a USB keyboard and mouse. But the best pranks in my view are like long-term pranks. So for 6 months, someone I used to work opposite, I just had like a USB mouse, so when he was moving his mouse, I would move it ever so slightly. But for like 6 months, so he kept clicking on the wrong stuff and he'd go and get annoyed. And when he was typing like an email, I'd just add the odd letter in and he's going mad. And he went back to IT and like they checked the machine over, gave him a new laptop, did it again and again and again and again. And
that's incredible.
And then like 6 months later, figured it out. Right, romance
yes.
fraud.
Yes.
So just to explain a little bit about why this is interesting. So I think it was the exact number was something like $2.7 billion of personal fraud done in Australia last year, and over 200 million. It was the third highest. That for me was interesting because I just wasn't expecting to see romance fraud as the third highest and over 200 million in Australia alone. That's reported.
I was going to say, you can guarantee it's a hell of a lot more than that.
So that caught me off guard, which is kind of why I immediately, it was like this kind of two things happened at once. That happened, and then someone else commented on your book saying this was amazing. I was like, bang, bang. And that's why I reached out and really wanted to have you on the podcast. But what will be really interesting is to kind of try and scratch a little bit around kind of what are some of the stories, what are some of the common ones to start with, kind of those use cases that we see in that romance fraud world.
So there are commonalities, and the stories, you'll often find that they start off very similar. So romance fraudsters use particular characters very often. The army is a really big one because obviously there's a lot of very handsome, rugged, young guys in uniform. Somebody that I guess romance fraudsters think that we all want. And their story will often be that obviously they're away in a war zone. They've got a child that they can't look after, so they need money. They've come across some money and they need help sending it back. All sorts of things. And of course, being away in a war zone is a great way of saying that they can't access money. They can't access proper internet, so they need help with iTunes cards or whatever it might be. But there's also oil rig workers. Same story. They've got a child that they can't see because they're away on the rig. And again, they can say that they can't access money. I mean, what I will say is that somebody on an oil rig doesn't need any money.
I've got a few friends who've worked in the rigs.
Yeah, and you don't need anything. But of course, if you don't know that world, why would you know that? You know, I didn't know that.
And I'm guessing these, like, it's a little bit more elaborate than the whole Nigerian prince who's got $1 billion that he needs to send it somewhere. These are a little bit more, they'll build a relationship over a period of time to kind of earn your trust. And then they kind of hit you with, and you come up with a solution sort of thing, opposed to them telling you.
Yeah, this is it. So, I mean, having said that, the problem with romance fraud is that there doesn't seem to anymore be a standard. So there are these commonalities in the story, but some people will ask for money outright within a few days. Other people will spend a year wooing somebody, not asking for anything. And then, 6 months, 12 months down the line, they'll have an issue. And as you say, the idea is that the victim then says, oh God, I tell you what, I can help you. The problem with that is in the long term, is that the victim feels absolutely ridiculous because when they look back on what's happened, they say, oh, well, it's my fault because I offered. So it's all really clever coercive control.
I get the feeling that most people will look at this and go, oh, that wouldn't happen to me. And then the reality isn't that. And I think that anyone can be tricked. It's just it's just until you get an elaborate enough plan or a patient enough plan, everyone eventually will get done.
Yeah, and all it takes is for somebody to be vulnerable for a few minutes. Now, I don't believe that all victims of romance fraud are vulnerable people. Some of the people I've spoken to for the book are CEOs, lawyers, police detectives. So these aren't vulnerable people, but all it takes is for a little chink in the armour, which we all have. I nearly clicked on a link for a post office scam about 2 days ago. And I was just about to do it because I wasn't concentrating on what I was doing. And I thought, oh my God, wait. But that's because I now work in this industry. So we all have that little chink where somebody can just kind of get in at the wrong moment. And they're very good at keeping your attention.
I think that's all scams. And I think that it's getting worse because the technology is getting better. So it's almost allowing them to scale their efforts further.
Oh,
right?
do you know, the AI, right? So romance fraud, one of the things that people used to be able to say is if you can't video call them, then it's a fraud. You know, why wouldn't you be allowed to see their face? But now with AI, well, they can call you. They can call you looking and sounding like somebody else. So you've no longer got that as a red flag. It's absolutely terrifying. A friend of mine sent me an AI generated Keanu Reeves the other day, and it was talking to me, saying how he loved my book and he wanted,
amazing.
Yeah. And now I knew what to look for. You know, it was slightly out of sync, but that's easily explained away by somebody saying the signal's not great. But it was his voice and it was his face. And she did it as a, you know, obviously as a joke. I was thinking,
But if someone can do
horrendous.
that as a joke because they're your friend, spending very little money or time, someone with an intent
Exactly.
who has a budget and more time can do something very, very good.
Of course
and
they
that's
can.
the scary bit.
Of course they can. And, you know, you can speak to somebody real time looking like someone else now. You know, and I've seen it done. And as I say, it hasn't been done with a big budget. So you can slightly see the differences, but that's because I'm looking. I'm really worried about AI for potential romance fraud victims because it is going to be a game changer. It's everything that a fraudster could possibly want.
Typically, when I first thought about this, I was thinking that most of the romance fraud is stemming from dating platforms. But I'm assuming it's all social online platforms people are being reached out to. Is it typically dating or is it all platforms?
Oh, it's all platforms. I mean, the ones that I get, I'm not on any dating platforms anymore. So the ones that I get are through Twitter and Instagram. And I'm trying to think out of the people I interviewed. Some were dating sites. In fact, one of the ones who actually managed to defraud a lady out of 120 grand, that was a dating site, a big dating site in the UK. But some of them have been via Instagram. They've just been, you know, liking somebody's pictures. And then eventually they kind of get in touch and say, I've been loving your account. This is great. And then they kind of start up a friendship in inverted commas. And it goes from there. I'm terrified of TikTok. So I've got an account and it just sits on my phone. But apparently it's massive on TikTok as well. But also,
Really?
yeah, it's huge on TikTok. But this is the thing, right? So I started playing, I'm a very, very tragic individual. And I started playing this kind of word game online. Just like kind of like a Scrabble ripoff, and you just play it on your phone and you play against other people. But it's kind of like Scrabble, and you just play against a random stranger. So you have your letters and whatever. Those games are full of scammers. So because you can direct message when you're playing,
right?
So it's, you know, they are
Are
everywhere.
these bots or these people?
These days, there's a real combination of the two. And it's hard to know. One of the ways that I tend to be able to find out is when I say absolute nonsense to them. If they come back and say, why on earth would you say that? That's absolutely ridiculous. I think, oh, right, okay, you're a real person. But some of them are bots. And even the bots are becoming more and more reactive and picking up on more keywords so they're able to answer questions. Currently, I don't personally think that the bots are generating massive amounts of money. But I think that time will come.
It's a brand new technology. There is a whole...
I know.
It's going to get a lot better.
I did a presentation to bankers in Frankfurt a couple of weeks ago. And I had a slide about changing technology and sort of how it's gone from letters, you know, all the way through to AI. And my last bit of the slide was just a question mark to say, nobody knows what's coming next. And that's what's so frightening, that we can't predict it.
It's scary. And like the thing that there's two elements to it. Maybe there's three elements to it in a sense of, yes, there's the financial impact of it. In Australia, 200 and something million of reported fraud, but you have to be vulnerable to go and look for love, and so on. And it's just these people getting, and like, especially if it's like preying on those people who are maybe the second time round, a little bit older, putting them. I think about my mum. My mum got divorced from my dad maybe 10 years ago. Like I can think about her kind of putting herself out there for the first time and going, no, I'm going to do this. And then getting scorned, even if there's no money there. Like then that just puts her off for the rest of her life. She goes, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. Like it's just so bad.
Do you know that one of the saddest things is that out of everybody that I interviewed, so I interviewed 35 to 40 victims, and the ones that I still know, which is a fair chunk, only 2 of them have tried to find another relationship. The other people have thought, do you know what? Nah. And, you know, a couple of these people are in their early 40s, way too early to be giving up, but they've been burned so much. And it's not the financial aspect, as you say, it's suddenly they feel they can't trust their own judgment. So they just rather not bother.
Yeah. And I know victim is always like not the right word to use or whatever, but like
I don't actually mind the word victim.
no, I don't mind it. I heard someone say the other day, and I shouldn't use the word victim, but I couldn't quite work out why. And I've heard that before, but I don't think it's a
I
bad
don't
thing.
mind it at all because people are victims of crimes. So it doesn't mean that you are a victim as a person. It just means that you have been the victim of a crime. So I kind of think that rather than change that word, we need to destigmatize it. I've been the victim of so many things in my life, but I don't feel like a victim. It's just that temporarily I was the victim of a crime, if you see what I mean. There's a big difference.
100%. And there's a lot of that in our society at the moment, right? We're just solving the wrong things. As a, I don't know how I can, what the right way of phrasing this is, because I wasn't catfished, but someone used my pictures to create a profile,
Oh, interesting.
but using my pictures.
Yeah.
They called themselves Hunky Kev. And he was on a dating site and was arranging to meet up with people and meet them in bars and so on. But this must have been happening quite broadly, but people started reaching out to actually me saying, hey, I wanted to let you know that this is happening. And I kind of went into a state of panic around, I've got a responsibility to tell the police because I don't know what the intent is of this random person. I actually found out who it was in the end. But I don't know the intent or like if he's meeting up with, like he was arranging, this girl said she sat in a bar for ages and Hunky Kev never turned up. But like, I don't know what could have potentially happened. But then talking to the police were like clueless, just going around in circles of, I can't do anything with this.
You'll remember from the book, I interview a guy whose image has been used hundreds of times. And he has had a nightmare. So he's had death threats. He's had people saying, you owe me £100,000 or you owe my sister or you owe my mum.
Oh, because they've used him for fraud stuff.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. His wife has been contacted to say, I'm speaking to your husband. He has had an absolute nightmare with it because he's all been used as fraudulent stuff. Now he's in the army, so he fits that typical profile. He's, I don't know, maybe 30s, really good looking. He also runs this kind of outside wilderness business. So he's always doing really manly looking things. So he's perfect for it. And without being weird, I mean, I said to my partner the other day, I've spoken to the most handsome man in Australia this morning. So you fit the perfect thing because you look like you do. So, of course, women are going to say, yeah, I'll have a date with him. But one of the problems, certainly in the UK, and I'm guessing in Australia as well, is that the police don't know what to do. They haven't got the time or the resource to be going around checking where these accounts are being made from and tracking people down. It just...
Is it the police? It must be because it's a crime, right?
It's a crime, but then...
It's not the same guy who's pulling me over for speeding is going to know what to do here. I don't know how it all works.
It's a really, really grey area. And, you know, over here, we had the online safety bill coming at the end of last year. And it's supposed to, I mean, it's not so much based around fraud. It's more based around kind of indecent images and that sort of thing and cyber flashing and whatever. But still, we have these laws. We kind of have these things that say, right, this is now a crime. You can go to prison for this. But there's nobody with the time or the knowledge to investigate it. it's almost a really easy way to get money with very, very few consequences. I mean, I spoke to somebody from Interpol when I was researching the book, and they'd kind of uncovered this ring. They'd got £800,000, and it was all coming from this place in Ghana. But that's because it's an absolutely massive fraud ring, you know, hundreds of thousands of pounds. If it's just somebody who, I don't know, has lost £1,000, it might be absolutely everything in the world to them. But the police are going to say, oh, you know, that's really bad, but stay offline.
Yeah, it doesn't help anyone.
No, not at all. Really frustrating. For somebody like me who speaks to a lot of victims, and we have action fraud over here, which is when you report fraud to the police, they will say, right, okay, go to action fraud. They are not fit for purpose. So people just don't bother.
Even if you go back a little bit, there was a few communities globally, but like a few kind of common countries it might be coming from who are doing this. And now it feels like it's happening like domestically in Australia. It's Australians hacking over Australians, especially as like the economy starts to take a little bit of a wobble, cost of living goes up, people start moving towards this. Like, I just think cure is not going to like cut it.
We have a challenge in that when we try to educate, we tend to do it in fraud industries, counter fraud industries, in a really boring, dry way. So when you click on your banking app, you'll get a warning. Is this a fraud? These are the signs to look out for. No one reads it. You just do like you do with terms and conditions. You just press OK, and then it comes up to the next thing. So no one, even though banks, government, police are putting out these educational initiatives to try and kind of prevent things, they're boring and they're not being read. And therefore, nobody is being educated. And it's one of the reasons, actually, that I wrote the book, because when I was talking to the publisher, I was saying, I want to do something where people want to read it. You know, so it kind of becomes, it's like, it's funny, it's engaging, but there's all these messages behind it. And it's been really great that I've had people message me saying, I left a relationship because I read this, or I read this and was able to say to my sister, this is what's happening. And I think we need to change how we try and prevent these things. Because as you say, we are chasing our tails.
Yeah. And I think that this is a shameless plug, but digital identity is such a cure for this in a sense of, and there's two elements to it. There's like phase one element, which is anyone on any platform should be verifying themselves, especially when it comes like dating, absolutely to be a no brainer, because you want to make sure if you're meeting up with someone that it's actually who you think they are. Social media around how you can blindly throw abuse and hide behind different aliases and so on. Like, you should be responsible. If you're going to go and say something you shouldn't do, you should be accountable for your actions online and in person. So I think that verification helps there. So there's that element of it. And I don't know why it's not more widely taken up, because the cost to verify now so cheap.
But I mean, look at what Elon Musk did. He's taken away the verification. Oh, but you can pay for it. So, you know, a fraudster who thinks they can make tens or hundreds of £1,000s a year, of course they're going to pay for this verification, but without anything behind it. So
it's verified without verification, because
exactly,
it gives you a blue tick.
Exactly.
So it gives you that sense of confidence, but they're not actually verifying anything.
Yeah, there's nothing behind it. I mean, I remember when the news came in that he was doing that, and I was midway through writing the book, and I thought, you have got to be joking. It was a fraudster's dream. And obviously part of the stuff that I wrote about was celebrities whose identities are used. Now, most of the celebrities whose identities I talked about, they would have had millions of followers, so they would automatically have had a blue tick. Now, they were taken away, so then suddenly you've got a load of Keanu Reeves accounts coming up with blue ticks. I was appalled by it.
I'm an Elon fan, but that's not the best move.
Oh, it was a dreadful move.
It's because it does the opposite. But I think like there's something needs to be done. It's like, especially when we as a user are the product, like they're all making money from us and by being able to sell ad space to us and from our data, the least they can do is protect us. And if the cost of verifying someone and checking their driving license or passport against the government database and their name. And it can all be done extremely securely nowadays. So there's no identity theft piece is like less than $1, like 50p, then you're going to make more than that per user back anyway. So like, protect me, like I'm your asset, protect me. So I think there's that element. And then the second piece, which is probably a bit further down the line, when you start having open ID, which is like, so you got multiple digital ID providers. And the example I use around this is like, if I'm buying a motorbike, let's say I'm going to buy a motorbike from you. So I pop around and I go, right, can I test drive it? You go, yeah, sure. But are you going to drive off with my bike? Like, and you might leave your mobile phone, or you might leave. In fact, I had a funny story because I did sell a motorbike and the guy wanted to leave I said, I trust you. Like I trust everyone. Won't be long. I'll be in version 2 of the book.
I'll be interviewing you in a couple of years.
Yeah. Luckily I'm married, so I've escaped that part. But I was like, no, he's like, no, let me leave you my phone because it makes me feel better. I was like, fine. So I took his phone, and then the worst thing happens is that he runs out of fuel because it's my fault for leaving it. On a bike, you don't always have a fuel gauge. So I didn't know how much fuel. So he ran out of fuel, and then it started raining. But in Australia, you don't carry a wallet. It's all digitally done now. So he couldn't top up with fuel. He couldn't call me. So then he had to walk like 2 kilometers back in the rain and going like, you ran out of fuel. I was like, I had your phone. Oh no. Because I started thinking, oh God, it's actually driven off now because he's taken ages.
Did he buy it?
He did, yeah. Not really nice guy.
Great, all right.
And he lives in the same. We both live in Bondi, so I see the bike driving around every now and again, which is nice. It's like in that scenario, I can like bump and go, right, here's my details. You don't have to share anything sensitive, but to go, right, verify that is Rob means that if you did drive off with it, I can take that to the police and go, this is the person who stole my bike. Like you've got it's the same as taking their driving license without actually taking all details. So it's like all those different scenarios around if I'm going to meet up with someone, you could theoretically ping them and go, right, ping your ID so I know that actually that is Becky before we go and meet up for a drink in the pub. Like, and just be a little bit more safe. And I just think that there's 2 elements. There's A, the education, but B, we're not thinking about the foundational part of how to make things more secure.
No, we're not. And it's a massive gap in the counter fraud world. We are constantly catching up, and the fraudsters are always a step ahead, because the disadvantage we have is that as, in inverted commas, normal people, we don't think like fraudsters. We're not as sneaky, so they're always one step ahead. Like that guy with the bike, he might have said, right, I'm going to leave you my keys, I'm going to leave you my phone. It could be a blank phone and keys to nothing. There's kind of, but if somebody said that to me, I'm going to leave you my keys and phone, I'd think, all right, fair enough.
Yeah.
But because I don't think like a criminal, I mean, I've started to more because I've started to get more sneaky in thinking what people are doing. But I think it's really frightening, and we need to start implementing solutions.
I use the example of like, when it comes back to an ID piece, but like we use a physical ID in a digital world. But we've got so many examples of using a physical mindset in the digital world that it leaves us so vulnerable to all these digital scams, be that dating or anything else. And I think that there's a huge education piece, but like, I just think where there's the foundations are just missing.
Yeah, I agree. And, as you rightly say, with stuff like dating, it's down to safety as well. It's not just fraudulent activity. It's knowing who you're meeting and being able to say to a friend, because obviously you're supposed to now, if you're going on a date with somebody you don't know, you're supposed to say to a friend, look, this is where I'm going. This is the guy's name. But you can go one step further than that. And I think that's really, really important. And we just don't do it.
There was a New Zealand dating piece where a guy murdered a girl. Horrible story. English girl was traveling the world. She was in New Zealand, and she just got murdered because of the guy found her, met up for a date, and then just took her back to his hotel room and murdered her. But he'd been on like 2 or 3 other dates, and people had reported it, and they couldn't find the guy because he wasn't verified. And it's like, I look at that and go, right, if you'd had verification on your platform, you'd have saved someone's life. At what point are we going to start bashing these companies? Go, right, if you want to have social media, or if you want to have a dating app, you need these minimum criteria. Protect people.
when I've spoken to, for example, dating apps that have said, well, we do have verification, it tends to be optional.
It's a revenue generator for them.
Yeah.
They're trying to make money from it.
But also, they say, okay, right, so you need some ID in order to be verified. You can buy fake ID, and some of it can be very convincing. So
the verification piece, if you use a proper verifier, you'll know if it's a fake ID or not.
But I'm not sure that they do. Well, I think in certain cases, from the people I've spoken to, you have to send a screenshot of I don't know, like, let's say a driving license. And they say,
which
okay.
is not secure. That in itself, you should not be doing. Like, don't send your identity like on email or anything like that, because...
Yeah, but this is exactly it. So, who knows where that data's going? Who knows where, that could be hacked and used? And I've got a real bugbear with some of the dating apps in this country. So you'll get to it if you carry on reading, which you need to. There's a lady who I interviewed who ultimately lost £120,000, and that was through a UK dating site. Now, once she realised that this had happened, she rang the dating site and said, right, this is the name of the guy and this is what's happened. And the dating site said, oh, I'm really sorry about that. I'll offer you a year's free membership. And that was their solution to this awful thing that had happened. I mean, they basically said, oh, it's a shame. See ya. It was awful. I mean, ultimately, they're not going to give her her money back, and that's fair enough. But it was just this kind of, that they could not care less. They could not care less. And it's part of this thing where victims of fraud, particularly romance fraud, they need to speak to human beings who have been trained to speak to victims. And I think people who work at dating sites, and actually, in actual fact, social media as well, we haven't caught up enough to get people to stop just reading from sheets. I've spoken to people who've gone into their bank and said this has happened. And they've said, well, did you send the money voluntarily? And they said, yeah. And they're like, well, it's not our problem then. So there is this attitude towards victims of fraud, and as I say, particularly romance fraud, where no one really cares.
In that scenario, every bank should have like a pattern bouncing ball to follow, and they go, oh, I've been a victim of fraud, it was romance fraud or whatever. And they go, right, we can't help you because it was voluntarily sent, but here's a helpline, or here's a website, or here's a group.
Okay,
here's
at least
the issue. Point someone.
There aren't any. So,
right.
Yeah, exactly. And this is another thing. So the police, banks, etc., they will signpost victims to victim support, Citizens Advice Bureau, even the Samaritans sometimes. But none of those people, although they're incredible and the organisations are great, I will say that, none of them are trained to speak to victims of romance fraud. Now, a friend of mine has just recently set up a
Which is not, sorry.
Yeah, isn't it?
It's the third biggest in the whole of Australia.
Yeah. Now, there might be groups in Australia, I don't know. But over here, there isn't a single funded romance fraud support group. And so people are kind of clamouring, like, where do I go? And nobody knows. Now, I won't say the name because I don't want it to be a blatant plug, but a friend of mine has recently set up a not-for-profit romance fraud kind of group. She has no training in it, but she was a victim of catfishing herself. And she's kind of working with one of the girls from the Tinder Swindler that was, the Netflix documentary. And they are inundated.
Really? Yeah.
Absolutely inundated. Now, they're doing it voluntarily. There's no funding. And I'm constantly saying to people in the UK, they need to be funded. But nobody will do it. And they are inundated day and night with people saying, I don't know what to do. I feel like a fool. How do I get my money back? People are desperate.
Oh, it's bad, isn't it?
It is bad. And do you know what as well? We have some fantastic police officers over here. Some that I've spoken to who really care, like genuinely put their heart and soul into this and do everything they can, which isn't much because the police are underfunded and, there aren't enough of them. But there are also some who don't really treat this as a crime. So one person I spoke to reported fraud to the police. They said, well, you've got to go to Action Fraud. But in the meantime, here are some organisations you could go to. And they gave them, various ones. And they said, oh, and here's Mind, which is a UK mental health charity. Now, the woman said, well, I don't need a mental health charity. And the policeman in uniform said, if you're sending money to strangers, I'd argue that you do. And I said, well, did you get his shoulder number? And she said, no, I just left. Because you would, wouldn't you? You'd be so upset and humiliated.
It just doubles down on the kind of whatever you're feeling at that point in time, that vulnerability. It just...
Oh, it's awful. It's just awful.
So, question for you. In Australia, when I talk about, I do think Gov has to kind of come in with a bit of a heavy hammer and try and demand that these platforms and so on have better security. But so Australia have, it's a loose announcement, but they've said that children of no confirmed age yet, but have to age verify to be able to, under a certain age, you're not allowed on social media. I don't know what age that will be, but basically an age limit. But what's your view on that as like a hard line to say, if you're under the age of X, then you're on no platform?
I think that's impossible to do. I really do.
Because people find a way around it.
Of course they will.
You don't really want to be, if you kind of hide the world from them, you don't want to be going onto this world at, I don't know, let's say the age of 18, suddenly you're allowed on, completely underprepared, because then you're going to be...
Yeah, do you know, I'm getting married and my partner has a 13-year-old daughter. And I have said to him, you do not know what she is looking at. And I talk to her and she sort of looks on all these social media and Snapchat, some of the messages that she said she gets on Snapchat from people. And the temptation is to say, right, that's it, you're never going on there. But as you say, suddenly they would be exposed to all this nastiness and this sneakiness. And it's almost like they have to build up this kind of hard layer.
Was the expression of strict parents make sneaky kids?
Precisely. And teenagers, my God, they're sneaky. I was great as a teenager. I could get around anything. But it is a really serious point. And I've been doing some research lately around social media and the impact on young people. I'm not sure there is a way around it. I don't think the answer is to just stop people from being on it. I think that would cause all sorts of problems.
I'm trying to think. I reckon, sorry, this is me hugely reading between the lines and making a big jump. I think it's more a case of, because they've not come out and gone, right, of this age, or this is how it's going to work, or this is how we're going to age verify, because they have none of the actual detail behind it. I think it's a scare piece for the platforms to go, right, 20% of your revenues come from under the age of 16s. We're going to ban that because we can't trust them on your platform because it hasn't got the right controls on it. So they've made this announcement, no under 16s because we can't trust the platforms. So to kick the platforms into gear to go, right, don't do that. Let us increase the controls to allow them to have a safer experience. And then they don't actually ever put that rule in the end. I'm thinking that's kind of what they're doing.
Yeah, you could be right. I mean, I don't know whether it's still happening, whether it ever came to anything. But one of the things that I found out recently, Roblox, Roblox. It's an app that loads of young people use. And I mean like early teens, even kind of, 10-year-olds. And it's got loads and loads and loads of games on it. Kid-friendly games. So you can go and like dress in a fashion thing. You can go and build worlds. It is massive. I'd never heard of it, but it is massive.
No, I've not heard of it until now. I call it Roadblocks.
When somebody first said it, I was like, what? But anyway, there's a group of parents who a while ago were suing Roblox because they found out that predators were getting on there and contacting their really young kids. But Roblox is made for kids. So that entire app, which it's got millions and millions of users worldwide, that whole thing would have to shut down under those rules. And that's not fair. That's a whole gaming experience that's not fair then. Because it's classed as social media, because you can message people, you can play with other people across the world. And the games are, some of them are really fun. And then you'd have to
It's
say,
really
right, well, in
hard.
that case, you can't have anybody over 18 on it in case you're a weirdo, but that's not going to work either.
And the trouble is that by the time you can get to a point where you can put any legislation in place, technology's moved on so fast that the legislation is no longer relevant anymore because it's taken 3 years to get it through Parliament. And now something else has existed that doesn't come into that legislation.
Exactly. It goes back to the thing you said earlier about we're always chasing our tails. Exactly the same. And it sounds like it's the same in Australia, but in the UK, there is so much red tape for everything that people come up with these great ideas. And as you say, by the time it comes to anything, everything's moved on and it's entirely irrelevant.
I was going to ask, as a plug for the book, who's your target? Because this, for me, I'm not sure if I'm pretty sure I wasn't your target audience, but it's been really interesting to read from someone who works in digital identity. But I'm sure I'm not your target audience. Who's your reader?
It's interesting you say that because when I was doing the proposal for this book 100 years ago, my agent said you need to put in there who your target market was. So initially, obviously, the first thing that came into the mind is the stereotype victim of romance fraud. So I was thinking like middle-aged women, that's who's going to buy this book. So that's kind of what I thought. And a lot of middle-aged women have read it, don't get me wrong. It's been really popular. But it's also really taken off within the counter-fraud community. Guys your age up to guys in their 60s have been reading it and enjoying it. And that's been a real eye-opener to me.
That was my connection into it. It was someone who was in the fraud industry who did a post about it, and that's how I found it.
I've been really surprised by how well it's gone down in the fraud community, which is amazing, but it's also kind of sad because it shows that there's not that much out there.
And I think that goes back to kind of where we started around the education of it for two reasons. A, to stop people falling into the trap, and B, to make people feel like they're not the only one. Like when I've said this 50 times now, like the third biggest kind of reason for fraud, like it's such a common thing, which is, again, goes back to what we're saying around the lack of support pieces around for this when it's that big. So actually having something there to make people think, okay, I'm not the only one.
Definitely. And like I say, the feedback from people has been saying, I didn't realise this. I am so pleased to have read about what other people have been through because it makes me feel less alone. And actually, I've managed to put a few people in touch with each other, to talk about their kind of shared experience, which is, it felt like a nice thing to do. I believe the most damaging form of fraud, not necessarily financially, although, as you say, third biggest in Australia, but it's the most emotionally damaging type of fraud because you're losing your money, of course, but you are losing what you believe your future was going to be.
100%. I'll give you another little shameless, I don't know, plug is the right word. My wife picked it up and started reading as well. And she's not in any of those groups. She's not in fraud. She's not in a victim. She just kind of started, pick this up and she's like, what's this? I never read. And she was like, she was suspicious the fact that I had a book in my hand and reading. And she knew I could read. So she started reading it as well and is enjoying it as well. So I think it's a book for anyone.
Right.
So I think we've covered everything, Becky. Thank you so much. I think it's really important that we, in our identity podcast, actually have someone who comes from an angle of the actual kind of result of when it goes bad, and talk to more kind of what the consumer and the impact of it. So thank you so much for your time and coming on.
You're absolutely welcome. It's been a pleasure to bounce around the topic.
Thank you. And hopefully we can fight a bit of romance crime together. Eh?
Yes. Continue to do my best.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us today on Idiot Proof. Rob and Becky had a great conversation about romance fraud, if you can have such a thing. But a huge thank you to Becky for shedding light on the emotional and financial toll these scams take and for sharing her insights on the tactics that fraudsters use to exploit trust and vulnerability. A few things I took away from today's discussion. Well, first, the scale of romance fraud is staggering, with billions of dollars lost each year. not to mention the emotional impact on victims and how long-lasting that can be. The second thing I learned was that fraudsters are using increasingly sophisticated techniques, including AI technology, to create elaborate stories and manipulate victims, and this makes digital identity verification more crucial than ever for online safety. Rob and Becky also touched on the critical role education and awareness play in preventing these scams and the need for social media platforms to step up their security measures to protect users. The good news is that digital identity solutions offer a promising path forward, helping to reduce the risks associated with online interactions and potentially safeguarding against future fraud. And we've got a giveaway with this episode. So we've got 10 copies of Becky's book, Keanu Reeves is Not in Love with You, to give away. To enter in to be eligible for one of these copies, go to Privy Australia's LinkedIn page, subscribe to our channel, and do the quiz to enter into the competition. And if you found this conversation insightful, make sure you subscribe to Idiot Proof for more discussions on how digital identity can shape a safer online world. Don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn for updates on upcoming episodes. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next episode.
Welcome to Idiot Proof, the podcast dedicated to digital ID.
In this series, you'll hear about everything from the recently passed Digital ID Bill through to some of the creative and abstract ways in which digital ID can be and is being used today.
I recently wanted to amend something on my will, and I thought, okay, when do I travel to Estonia? I need to book a time, la 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 la. And then I realized I can actually identify with digital identity and get that done, even though I'm in Australia. Life is just easy, and more they're seamless services.
As a podcast, we want to bridge the gap from what the F is digital ID
through to that sounds great, get me one of those.
With digital ID, you obviously do an initial verification of your core documents, and then that ability to reuse that over and over. My biggest bugbear is trying to drag the birth certificate. Every time I have to do that, I'm just like, oh, God, that's a pain. Plus, who's getting it?
Your hosts are the lovely Sally McKenzie and myself, Rob Hotchin.
And I think one of the good things about the digital ID is that it really prioritises choice. You'll start to see innovation.
Sometimes feel like I've got a car and I'm selling to someone with a horse. And I think that people don't always realise there is a better solution.
We hope you enjoy listening and maybe even learn a thing or two. I know I will.